Thank you so much, Tanya, for inviting me to be part and contribute to this session, which is about literature reviews. I should first say that, yes, I'm based in Belgium, in Brussels, where I've been living for some years. I'm working at a university a bit outside Brussels called Université Catholique de Louvain, French-speaking university. And I've been working there for around 2.5 years, being affiliated with a project about teachers' careers across Europe and globally, but with a focus on Europe. I'm originally from Denmark and did our Sociology of Education Masters at the Danish School of Education based in Copenhagen. And I'm saying this, these things about my background so that you get let's say, a sense of that I'm very much based in Europe, in Western Europe. And one point that I'm going to return to when we're talking about literature reviews is, of course, that we have our positionality and the way that have been being part of this literature review and the way I've been conducting it, of course, reflects my background as a sociologist of education and being based in Western Europe. So we'll probably return to that point. Yes, so I have prepared some slides, PowerPoint slides, and I'm happy to share that after the presentation. And some of you have also received the working paper, those of you affiliated with Lancaster University. If you are interested and are not based in Lancaster, you can just send me an email and I'm happy to share this working paper with you, which I would ask you not to quote or distribute to colleagues because it's work in progress and we have other papers currently in review in different journals. So yes, but happy to share, certainly. Okay, I will try to share my screen here. Let's see. I think this is it. And there should be a slide now for all of you to see. Is that true, Janja?
I can see it. Can people say in the chat if you see it as well?
Okay.
Yeah, people see it.
Very good, very good. And as I said, I'm happy to share these slides after the presentation, so you don't need to take too many notes if you're inclined to do so. Yes, so we have 3 main elements for the next 1.5 hours. I'm first going to introduce some main distinctions about literature reviews. It is a term that is very much used in a common sense way in daily life, but we are also all aware that reviews are surrounding us in academic life and as researchers. So I will introduce some terms for us to think about when we are thinking the undertaking of reviews, and hopefully you will find this useful. And I think that will take around 15 minutes. And if you have any questions for clarification, you can please note them and send them to Janja. She will take care of them. The second part is related to an example of a so-called scoping review that we have undertaken as part of the so-called TeachersCareers project. I'm part of a team of around 8 people that have been working on this TeachersCareers project with the principal investigator, Professor Xavier Dumais, who is based at Université Catholique de Louvain. And I will introduce this review that we've been working on for 2 years. And for inspiration and to go into quite some detail about how did we do this and why did we do it in this way. Yes. So it might be a bit meandering, a bit slow, or let's say very focused on detail, but I hope it will be useful for you in one way or the other. And then we should have plenty of time for questions and answers in the end of the session also. So I have probably material to around 45 minutes. So yes, there should be plenty of time for debate and some challenging questions. First of all, I should say that for context, in the undertaking of any review, it is of course important to think about what is the landscape that we're actually looking at. What are the patterns in publication, in the production of research and knowledge? And I'm going to also, as part of this session, I'm going to refer to of references that I think will be useful for you. They are also, I think, mentioned all of them in the working paper that I have distributed. But a lot of useful references, I hope, for you to note as well. So there is this very interesting by Johan Heilbronn about the social sciences as an emerging global field. And he points out that today, over the last 20 years, the social sciences have become much more widely practiced. There's much more knowledge being produced in the social sciences, and there's more transnational collaboration. At the same time, English has become even more dominant. So we don't see a diversification in this way in the production of research in various languages. Yes, there might be some research being produced in all sorts of languages, but English is actually becoming more and more dominant. And that is, of course, important when we're thinking about the sort of reviews that we undertake. Johan Heilbronn also points out that there is still very much a core periphery structure in the globalizing field of social sciences, with the US and Europe very much dominating. Despite that, it is becoming more widely practiced. And these things are definitely worth considering and keeping in mind when you undertake your literature review, and choose also, depending on your own competences, what sort of reviews or what sort of literature you can actually read yourself. So to keep in mind. Then there are many types of literature reviews, and this is a rather banal observation. You are all obviously aware of that. But just to introduce some main distinctions. And Mary Kennedy, who is based in the US, she has a very interesting article, educational researcher from 13 years ago, 2007. And she points out that the different sorts of reviews obviously serve different purposes in terms of being focused on theoretical development or policy purposes. And she notes that there has been a colonization of the discourses about reviews, and where systematic reviews is being presented as the sort of golden standard and a very particular sort of systematic reviews. And I'll return to what that means, what kind of systematic reviews we're talking about. But then if you don't do this particular sort of systematic review, well, then you're seen as being unsystematic or non-systematic. And she points out that, no, don't think about it like that. You're just doing a different sort of review. And she points out in her article to other sorts of reviews: integrative, theoretical, methodological, historical. And that's one way of making these distinctions. So other sorts of reviews that might not be so focused on policy development, policy design, but on maybe more on theoretical development and in thinking about the field that you're a part of. Then there's another interesting article that looks at different types of reviews, actually 14 different sorts of reviews. And it's taken from a health sciences journal, which is not a coincidence, since reviews are obviously very much used in the health sciences. They point out in their critique of the field of reviews, in their review of reviews, that there's a lot of confusion, a lot of ambiguity, and sometimes that is counterproductive. So therefore, their point is we need to be clear about what kind of reviews are we doing, and how do we conceive of this sort of review. And these are the 14 types And it's just an illustration. The particular list here is not very, very important. This is just a list that is included in their very interesting article of Grant and Booth. And as you see already in the matter or the label of the review, there are obviously overlaps. To return to this notion of systematic literature reviews, and I'm sure you have all come across it, and often it is being seen as let's say, a golden standard or a higher standard, as something special in the very confusing field of literature reviews. And it's here important to note that experts writing within the field, for example, a very prominent scholar like Ray Pawson, who is based at Leeds University, I believe, or at least used to be, and Pettigrew and Roberts, also experts on this systematic literature reviews, they point out, well, systematic literature reviews is not one thing, but it is true that from the late part of the 90s, the notion became very, very dominant, influential, not least in the United Kingdom, or maybe especially in England, I could imagine, because of the new emphasis on evidence-based policy. Often focused on effectiveness of interventions, meta-analysis, statistical pooling of primary research studies. But there are other sorts of systematic literature reviews. We have other experts on systematic literature reviews that make this distinction between so-called aggregative reviews and configurative reviews. Aggregative reviews, which would typically be associated with systematic literature reviews, meta-analysis, pooling of different research studies, where it is imperative within the time to be exhaustive of all the research that is out there. And they oppose that with so-called configurative reviews that serve different purposes and that are more oriented towards mapping and discussing patterns in a specific body of literature, and also the findings that are reported in that literature, if you choose so. If we try to summarize the different review types, and I'm aware this is a huge discussion, there's a big literature out there, and again, I can only recommend you to go to some of the references I have pointed to. But if we take Ray Pawson, for example, and his encouragement to think more broadly about systematic literature reviews, well, then we can distinguish between two types of them. We can have those that are very much focused on policy design and on identifying the effectiveness of interventions, policy interventions often, where it is imperative to be exhaustive of all the research out there. And then you have other sorts of systematic literature reviews that are more focused on theory building and perhaps also testing of hypothesis, and where it is more about thinking about the literature that you're investigating, trying to find patterns in it, different strands, different ideas, different concepts that are being used. And as part of that, we could think of so-called configurative reviews that I mentioned just before, and the cluster of conceptual reviews that Mary Kennedy wrote about, the integrative, theoretical, methodological, and historical reviews. And when we come back to the title of this webinar about treating literature as empirical data, I would say, I mean, one main message for me, at least, and we can discuss that later, that is that all of these review types, you can treat the literature that you're interested in, depending on the purpose of your research objectives. You can treat the literature as empirical data, so to say, material that you can analyze and discuss. And then the question is, well, how aware are you of the steps that you take in that endeavor? How systematic are you in order to be aware of the bias and there's bound to be some kind of bias, I would say. But how aware are you of the bias in your review and the decisions that you take as part of your review? So this is an attempt to summarize the different review types. And I think actually, yes, that is already the first part of my presentation, the more general part that I have concluded, so to say. I'm sure I'm just opening up for a huge discussion, but yes, this is the first part, more generally about different sorts of literature reviews. And the next part then concerns the specific review that we have undertaken as part of the project that I'm part of. But if we have any questions at this point for clarification, we could have a few maybe. I don't know, Janja, what do you say?
It doesn't look like there are any questions at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I think you can just go on.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, there's one question. Go ahead, Anna. Seems like it's being typed. Okay, what is the difference between configurative and conceptual reviews?
Yeah, that's a very good question, huh? And yeah, and I think the best way that that at least I can address that question is to say that there are many terms out there. There are different, very proficient scholars in this field, and they're operating with different concepts. And there are obviously very big overlaps between configurative and conceptual reviews. And if you want me to point out to specific differences, how they overlap and how they are different, well, I think I would owe you an answer to that. I could not be clear, like say in very few words, how the so-called configurative reviews would be different from the conceptual reviews that Mary Kennedy is writing about in her article. But they are overlapping, and they both have as a purpose, as a main purpose, to discuss a specific body of literature from a more conceptual, from a more theoretical angle. And you could also, taking up the point from Mary Kennedy about historical reviews, well, how does our field develop over time? If we contrast that with the aggregative reviews, the history of the field would not be a concern. If you're looking for, let's say, the best intervention against the COVID-19 virus, no, what matters is the effectiveness of the intervention, not the long discussions in the research literature about how we got there. That is not a concern, really. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Can I read out another question, Tore?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I have another question, which is a bit longer, but that's all right. How important is it to be systematic in the traditional sense? Can you allow your reading to lead you down tangents if you're doing a more abductive study, and allow you to move your study in the direction the reading takes you? Or is it more accepted to plan your direction of literature review and stick to it and not allow yourself to go down unplanned paths? So, you know, you will address that later, I think, or would you like to already start talking about this now?
Well, I could mention it already now, because you're right, Janja. We're coming back to it later with this specific example that I'm going to introduce. But if you look at, I think this model is quite widely used, or something that looks a lot like it, and that's the main stages in a so-called systematic literature review, and it can be taken in different directions. And at least what we have experienced in the review that we have undertaken, and also I've seen other scholars, when they're referring to these stages, they point out, well, there is a bit of going back and forth. As you dive deeper into the literature, you will probably be more specific about your research question. When you try to define the scope of your review and design a search strategy, well, as a reflective being, you are bound to ask new questions and start to consider the field, the body of literature that you're interested in a new light. That's at least what we have experienced. So I think it is important not to be too rigid, too schematic, and also these researchers here that are mentioned on this slide, they will point out that you're bound to go a bit back and forth. So I think that answers the question to some extent. Yes, that you can go back and reconsider, of course, without changing completely track, of course. I mean, then you are onto something new anyway. So, yeah.
Okay, brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we can continue now.
Okay, great. I'm just looking at my watch, so to see that I don't go over time. The thing is that, as I said, as part of the project that I'm part of, the so-called TeachersCareers project based at Université Catholique de Leuven, started out doing a so-called scoping review back in autumn 2017. And it's been a long time since we took the first steps in developing the methodology of this review. And it has actually been good to return to it now, to have this focus on the methodology again, because I can see that we have taken some decisions that seemed pretty obvious at the time, but I actually see them a bit in a new light now. So actually I have come to reconsider some of the decisions we have taken, not because I regret them, but becoming maybe more aware of the implications. So it's been actually returning to the methodology, like I've had to prepare for this webinar. So the review forms part of the TeachersCareers project, and that is a 5-year project. And this review is supposed to build at least part of the foundation for the project. And this way it's as integrated as it could become of the project, the better. And that's of course always a challenge, but it was meant to form a foundation of this project about teachers in Europe, their careers, their qualifications, labor markets. We have some researchers doing a very interesting labor market research for teachers in London and in different places in France. And we'll also have a study in Brussels. So what is really interesting about this study is that we're looking both at policy, but we're also looking at actually labor markets and the flows in those. So those of you interested in teachers out there listening to this webinar, I think and hope that this project would be interesting to you. Anyway, what we see out in the literature is that there's a stronger political attention being directed towards teachers and teaching since the 90s. Nationally and internationally, and also in international organizations like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the World Bank, also in Europe, in the European Union. So there's more and more attention at various scales. And that is important to keep in mind when considering the motivation for this review. In parallel, or let's say sometimes in symbiosis, there's also an increased research production about teachers and teaching, along with this stronger political interest. Which doesn't mean, of course, that all the research obviously is not shaped by political considerations and agendas. Some of it is certainly. So if we try to define the objective of the particular review that we have undertaken, I have put it on the slide, to identify and discuss patterns in this increasing amount of research out there about teachers in international and global contexts since the 90s. What are the major theoretical traditions and themes? And to which extent and how does this literature theorize globalization? And the last part is really important because there's been some great research being undertaken by people like Antoni Werger at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and the research group that he's leading and part of, that talks about globalization and education policy. And they talk about if we want to understand what is going on in the world of teachers or education more generally, actually, well, then we need to consider globalization and how globalizing processes shape the decisions that are being taken at different scales, internationally, nationally, and locally. So we are interested in this review. When it comes to teachers, does the literature actually theorize globalization? When they talk about teachers in international contexts. As I mentioned just in the beginning of the review, we are preparing some papers right now that are in review that are focused on the findings of this review. And they are currently, the review is in review, so to say. And then I prepared this working paper specifically for this session, which is focused on the methodology. It means I'll be focusing on the methodology because I think that is the interest that unites us since Janja defined the content and the objective of this webinar. So I'll be focusing on the methodology and the steps involved. So, and what is a scoping review then? Another term. And I have included some references here. The two first talk about more generally about scoping reviews, and the two latter ones are examples relating actually to education and where the concept of a scoping review is introduced and discussed and being applied to show something about the field of research and also the findings reported in that research. And I should be aware and I should make a point out of distinguishing between their use of this term. Again, scoping review can be used to mean different things. And Grant and Booth that I referred to before, those people that reviewed 14 different types of reviews, they have a different conception of what a scoping review is. It's seen as something more preliminary and more preparatory, so to say, paving the field or paving the way for our systematic literature review. And that's not how we have been using the term of scoping review. We're relying more on the references at the top of the slide. Arksey, Peters, Verger and all their colleagues. And if we return to the notions, the terms that I introduced before about configurative, conceptual, and systematic, our scoping review is configurative since it wants to identify patterns, themes, and schools of thought in a specific body of literature. And also, let's say, the dissent, the matter of the level of agreement and disagreement in a field, we're interested in that. It's also a so-called conceptual review because we are thinking about the use of theories. People have thought about it, this particular problem about teachers and teaching in the context of globalization. Also the blind spots in the literature. And as Mary Kennedy says in her article, to think aloud about the nature of the question. Our review is also systematic in a particular sense, not in the sense that has become taken for granted in some quarters, in many quarters actually, where it is being used as a synonym for aggregative reviews, exhaustive reviews of meta-analysis. No, but we are certainly trying to be systematic in undertaking a specific series of stages to increase transparency about the decisions that we have taken, so that readers can better be able to actually judge the contribution that we hope to make. But we are not driven by a single well-defined question, as in aggregative reviews. We're not trying to identify best practices out there in the world of teaching and the best teacher. That's not what we're looking for. I hope that is reasonably clear. And here we have then the slide again about the stages in systematic literature reviews. And again, to repeat what I said before, it should not be understood as too rigid that you have to complete one stage before you can move on to the next. Not entirely, but at least this is the sense of direction that you would be having when you undertake a systematic review in the broadest sense, not just in the narrowest sense. So, and I'll be focusing on the stages that are in bold, the scope, the design, and the screening and the coding, and then the findings I will only touch very, very superficially. Yeah, there's a lot to say about these 10 stages, and but our main point is that you are not going. They are not clearly, let's say, separate. They are overlapping, and you will be going a bit back and forth during your review undertaking. That's at least what we have been doing. Defining the scope, I think, has been extremely important for us in our scoping review. And even though that you will, if you choose to undertake a review and you're not undertaking a so-called scoping review, well, you'll still be thinking about what is the scope of what you want to include in your research. So this notion of scope is not exclusive to scoping reviews. It's something that we all have to think about in the undertaking of reviews. For us, it was important to think about teachers as a particular social group working at the specific levels. I'm aware of that many of you are mainly interested in higher education. That was not our main interest. Our main interest was primary and secondary. The project that it is part of the review, the TeachersCareers project. We're interested in the work of teachers, the so-called educational work, and both what happens in classrooms, but also in the workplace and in the labor markets related to teachers. We're interested in the politics, as teachers and teaching as being a subject to the political dimension, to regulation. And we are interested in the so-called scalar dimension, which just means that we want to go beyond focusing on studies that are mainly concerned with the national or even the local. We are interested in international trends as teachers and teaching in international context or even global contexts. These 4 dimensions have been extremely important for us, and we have been able to return to them as a resource in subsequent stages, designing strategies for searches, the screening, and also to some extent the coding of the literature.
Can I ask something here, Tore?
Yeah.
How did you come up with these 4 dimensions?
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, how did we do that actually? Some people have been asking sometimes, are they theoretically informed? And I regret to say, not really. They're very much defined by the interest of the project, of the TeachersCareers project, that are interested in policies and in labor markets related to the teaching profession, in particular levels of education, in primary and secondary education, and at a global scale. Yeah. So we looked at we basically had a look if they are theoretically informed. Well, yes, they are, to the extent that they're informed by the project, by the overarching research project that the scoping review is meant to inform, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it's basically more connected to your research questions and research design.
That's true. You could also say that. Exactly. They are very much informed by the research questions of the research project that this review forms part of. Very much so.
Okay, thanks.
Extremely important distinction to make for everybody making a review, also for us, was, if you look at the literature out there and how much there is, what kind of decisions will you take in terms of what you want to include and exclude? We were being rather, let's say, traditional in giving priority to articles and books, anthologies, and monographs that has undergone some kind of peer review, either in a publishing house or in an academic journal. Thereby, we exclude a huge body of literature that is issued by organizations nationally, internationally. Just think about the OECD, or the World Bank, or UNESCO, or the English Department for Education. If we had included that, there would be a lot more literature to look into, but we did not want to do that because we want to look at research that had been peer-reviewed academically, whatever that means, and that is a long discussion too. But that's the decision that we made. Also, because that we thought that these different organizations, like the Department for Education in England, for example, or in any other country, well, they'll have their obvious political interests. And I'm not saying that researchers don't have political interests. Of course, many of them do. Most of us have, whether we are aware of it or not. But anyway, we chose to focus on so-called academic literature. Then also, we excluded literature that did not theorize or address globalizing processes with a focus on, but did so without doing that with a focus on teachers. I'm here talking about the econometrics literature, which is very much, and what I'm trying to be specific about is here that if you look at literature by Erik Hanushek and Ludger Wosman and others that have been very influential internationally, at least in Europe and in the OECD, the research is cited a lot. Well, they are not theorizing or addressing globalizing processes at all. So we excluded that right away. Yeah, that was the entry point for inclusion and exclusion criteria. I hope that was reasonably clear. Then we have the search strategy, and that also merits some explanation. There's so many literature reviews now that are being driven by electronic database searches. And what we found in our review when we started doing our database searches, for example, in Scopus and ERIC, that you probably all of you know those. There are other databases, of course, but that's the two that we chose to focus on. We saw that there was a lot of literature that was not even included in these databases. And that sort of made it very, very clear to us right away, well, we cannot only rely on electronic databases in this scoping review. We need to look broader. We need to have a broader search strategy. What we did was that we identified a list of around 107 titles that we thought, well, these are major contributions to the literature about teachers and teaching in the context of globalization. That was both special journal issues, monographs, anthologies, a few separate journal articles as well. Complementary to that, we identified 4 different reviews that already existed in the field. Very interesting reviews. We thought that these were among the very best that we could find. That was another decision that we took and that we are making and that we are arguing for, so to say. The rationale of compiling the bibliographies, the list of references, basically, from the end of these reviews. And then we got a huge list, you can imagine, of literature. Altogether, that made 990 titles of literature from these different sources as a direct result of this search strategy. I think that there was around 100 electronic, 100, no, that's not true, around 400 from the electronic databases. From the hand search, there was another 400, 450 maybe. And as I said before, there was around 107 from the so-called purposive sampling, from this key contributions that we identified. We screened all of that, all those 990 titles. And then we coded that literature. When we screened, we used the 4 dimensions that I mentioned before that define the scope of our review. If you remember, teachers as a specific social group working in primary and secondary education. These were the levels of education we were interested in. That relates to the educational work of the labor markets of teachers in a broad sense. That has some kind of focus on policy, or the politics of education and teachers and teaching also. And that there's this scalar dimension, that it is something that goes beyond the local or the national, but puts teachers and teaching in a wider perspective, beyond the nation state at least. And one interesting point, I think, for me at least, was that if you think about globalization, and there's a long discussion, of course, about what is globalization, and I will not go into that in this presentation, into that long debate. It is addressed to some extent in the working paper that has been distributed. You can see that if you think about globalization as time-space compression, as David Harvey would have us think, well, in our review, and that is pretty subconsciously, I would say, that is only the last few days that I came to realize this. Well, like so many other people, we have been emphasizing the spatial dimensions of globalization, not the temporal. And I'm not still sure how we would define the scope of the review if we would be more focused on the temporal dimensions of globalization as compression of time. That was just a sort of afterthought I had when I prepared for this webinar. Anyway, we didn't screen for quality. We did develop some more nuanced criteria on the way. So for a minor part of the 990 different pieces of literature that we screened. And that is also addressed in the working paper. I'm not going into great detail with it here now. We can return to it in the discussion if you'd like to. Anyway, we excluded then a long list of studies, the vast majority, those that actually focus on other professions. That was part of this body of literature that we screened. There was something about psychologists. There was something about early childhood education. There was something about higher education as well. We took that away. Also, those that did not have a clear focus on teachers, even though they focus on education. And that literature that focused exclusively on curriculum, we also made the choice to exclude that because the figure of the teacher was more or less, let's say, tacit, non-present in some of the titles. We took those away, but this was a very small minority of the studies where we had to make this decision. Other studies where teachers was maybe mentioned, but was not really being used to explain anything. And some comparative studies that would be employing methodological nationalism, like comparing England and Sweden, for example, as nationally bounded and contained, self-contained cases without thinking about international or transnational flows or global flows, excluded as well. And
okay, Tore, we have a few questions.
Okay, let's have them.
Yeah, so some are related to the screening phase and some I think are already to the previous, but about the screening phase, what do you mean no screening for quality?
Yeah, that's a good point. No screening for quality. Let's say that we go back, it's a very, very, it's a very important question. I think we should take this one, yeah. Of course, there are these two dimensions to our decision not to screen for quality as part of this review. One of them is that, well, we assumed the literature already to be, since it was peer-reviewed, in principle at least, from journals, publishing houses, so on, that there should not be a need, and that is worth a discussion, of course, but since it is peer-reviewed, well, the quality should be okay. That's one thing. What I would say the more important reason is the nature of our review. We're interested in the body of literature. We are not interested in finding the best possible policy intervention about the best practices of how to be a teacher, for example, or the best practices related to professional development, and that we would like to make specific recommendations about that these are the best ways of training teachers in their career after they finish their initial education. In those sort of reviews, I would argue that it is more important to screen for quality and be more, let's say, be more aware of it. For us, it was really not the main concern about the quality of research. It's also very hard to operationalize for the body of literature that we had, at least. There was a lot of review essays included, in the body of literature that we looked into. So a lot of the titles were not based on original empirical research, but was discussing existing research, which is important, of course, a very important contribution to make also, to develop these review essays. And so there you already have that makes it harder to talk about validity, reliability of findings. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. So when I'm talking about quality, screening for quality, it's about the validity of findings. Where were we? Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope that was clear.
Yeah, thank you. And can we just go back to the search strategies or criteria? Yeah. So there's one question about how did you become aware of the key contributions, or how did you find them? So did you search them manually and electronically?
Yeah, that's a great question. How did we do that? I think we did it, and you can hear already now, I'm already reflecting about the question. Okay, how did we actually do that? We found it extremely important to include these sort of contributions because they were not included in the electronic databases. And we could also see in the hand search, that is the compilation of bibliographies from existing reviews, like very good reviews in the field already, that there were some contributions that were not there still. And we really wanted to include them because we found them important. We could see that the scholars contributing to those so-called key contributions were absolutely some of the major in the field. So we chose to include some main handbooks. We included a World Yearbook of Education. In the working paper, there is the full list of the key contributions. So yeah, main handbooks, major anthologies about teachers in international and global contexts, some journal articles, for example, Susan Robertson's important chapter from 2016 about the global governance of teachers' work. We found that to be a key contribution. So I should add that other reviews choose to have some kind of to consult other scholars in the field, which I'm aware that is I'm convinced that is a good strategy as well. Talking with other prominent scholars about what are the main contributions in this field. We have not done that, but we have shared our reviews, our review with some prominent scholars, and yeah, they think that we have included a lot of the important literature. But one way of doing it is to consult explicitly a list of different scholars. But that, of course, raises other questions. Who are you asking? Why this person, not that person? Raises other issues. So to be short, put it in short, we found a strong need to complement the hand search and the electronic databases, and we drew on our own knowledge, and what we could see were some of the main handbooks and anthologies that has been issued in recent years. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So it was a combination of different strategies and sources.
Indeed. Yeah.
And there's another question from Thomas. If you are generally recommending to avoid UN publications and similar grey literature in the literature review, or was this just a principle for your specific project?
That's another very good question. I would never say that would be a general recommendation to ignore what we have conceived as the grey literature. For other people, depending on the purpose of the review, the objectives of the review, it might be central to look into some of the very interesting publications that are being issued by UNESCO, by the OECD, by other of the main international organizations out there in the field. It really depends on what is the sort of contribution that you want to make with your review. It was we wanted to focus on the academic literature. We are certainly not saying that what the OECD and UNESCO is doing, that is not research. Obviously it is. But with the criteria for academic peer review, we excluded it. But I would certainly never say that it was a general recommendation.
Okay, thank you. That's all at the moment for questions.
Okay.
Sorry, one more. What were the keywords that you used in your search strategy, and how did you define those specific keywords?
That is, short answer is, it is included in the working paper, how we did that in detail. It took some time, depending on the specific parameters in ERIC and Scopus that we chose to conduct database searches in. We had to adjust and, let's say, to tune the search strengths, finding a balance between the specificity of the research and what's the other term? There's
general comprehensiveness, or
we had to include. There are two specific terms, and I forgot the other term right now, but it's included in the working paper. We had to find a balance between having rather broad searches, but also having a fair amount of those titles that actually came out of the searches being relevant. And we found that if we had very broad searches, if we had very broadly defined search parameters, we ended up with thousands of titles that would, on the one hand, give too much work for us. We were mainly just 2 people involved in this review, which is another point where we can discuss actually only being 2 people involved in this. But and another is that the vast amount, like 95% maybe of the titles, we would screen them immediately and see, well, this is just not relevant for us. That easily happens. So we actually had rather narrow searches, and we used the 4 dimensions that I mentioned before: the social, the work, the political, and the scalar dimension. We let that inform our search strategies, and to pick out the keywords, the abstracts of the searches, and so on and so on. But it's mentioned in detail in the working paper. But it's certainly a very, very good question. How did we do it? And it took a lot of going back and forth about finding what we think was some pretty good searches, pretty broad, but also with a rather high level of relevance for us in the search, in the titles that came out of the searches in the databases.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask a very pragmatic, hands-on question, technical, for screening? So for the phase of screening, how did you do the screening as such? Obviously, you didn't read in detail all of the 900 plus references. Just how do you go about this initial, or did you go and do it in steps, or how do you do it?
Yeah, well, a lot of the literature, as you say, we certainly did not have to read it all. We started out reading the title and the abstract, and already there, I would say that for at least half of those 990 references, we could screen them either as included or excluded. Then there were quite a big part of the literature where we had to read it in a bit more detail, but it was only, I would say, 5%, maybe 10% of these 990 references that we actually had to read in more detail, maybe even in full to decide whether we would screen it as being included or excluded from the review. Yeah, but yeah, the huge chunk of it, just the abstract or even the title. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can proceed.
Great. I think I will go rather, I'm just looking here. Okay, yeah. So what we have left is then the coding. Coding was very, very important for us also. And there were two distinctive steps. And I would like to say that one of them was rather descriptive. And the other one was numbers-based. And you could distinguish between them in saying that the extraction of characteristics resulted in a huge table in a Word document where we basically put in a lot of information from the 279 references. 279 references was what came out of the original pool of 990 references. After the screening, we are down to 279. And that's what we read in more detail than for the coding. So I mean, after the screening, well, we obviously had to read in quite a lot of detail these 279 pieces of literature. And so to say, registering these different characteristics that are mentioned here on the slide. The coverage in terms of system and the scalar dimension, the so-called teacher key topics, the use of globalization theory and theorists, maybe also some other main theoretical sources, but we haven't really been using that, but focus on globalization theory, certainly when it comes to theory, and also methodology and data. We registered that, we put that in our big table. Then on the basis of that, we came to develop a numbers-based coding system where we basically coded each title, the 279 titles, according to these different codes. Which type of study is it? What kind of topics related to teachers does it address? Each title in this literature for each of the 279 titles. What kind of globalization theory? And now we are addressing the conceptual framework, which is addressed in more detail in the working paper. But yes, we distinguish between different sort of globalization theories, and we coded each piece of literature in terms of how does it use globalization theory if it uses it, because actually it showed up that a lot of the literature didn't use any globalization theory at all. And then we also coded with the sort of empirical data that were being used, or if none was being used. And we were, of course, interested, not so surprising, in whether international large-scale assessments were informing these studies. Yeah. So we had two distinctive levels of coding. We started with a very descriptive, getting familiar with what is really there in the literature that we are reviewing. And on the basis of that, we developed this numbers-based coding system. And when I'll show you a few findings, you will see how we've been using this coding system based on numbers to come up with some interesting findings, we believe. Yeah. I should also say, when it comes to the teacher key topics, I think it's also here on the next slide, yes. these were the main topics that we could see on the basis of our reading of the literature, on the basis of our extraction of characteristics of the literature that was under review. We see, okay, these are really the main topics, and they are pretty well in line with some of the other reviews that have been undertaken in the field. Other reviews that have been of a very different nature than ours, but I mean these topics are not so surprising, so to say. It's also important to mention that the titles could address more than one topic. Often they would address 2, maybe even 3, or perhaps even more of these topics. So you could, for example, have a book that would address 4 or 5 of them. But you wanted to register to see, okay, what is being discussed in the research literature. I'll present a few findings, and then I'll do that very quickly so that we can discuss the methodology, because it's probably what you're most interested in. And I should again say that everything I've been saying here during this webinar is included in the working paper, more or less, I would say. So in pretty much detail, in more detail than what I could say here during the webinar. Review findings, not so surprising. Steady increase in the number of references. In the body of literature that we have been reviewing, there's certainly a sort of tipping point in the mid-2000s. There's a lot of literature that has been issued after 2005. That's just a body of literature that we have been reviewing. We cannot say that that is representative of the field as a whole, because we have not tried to be exhaustive of the whole field, since we're not doing an aggregative review. When it comes to the 6 key teacher key topics, also increasing number of titles addressing these different aspects of the teaching profession. Even though that mixed picture, this is a mixed picture. There's some topics that are being more addressed and others not so much over time. Then there are some theoretical developments with regard to globalization. For example, in neo-institutional theory, they have become more aware of the agency of teachers and of different actors, and they're trying to incorporate that into the theory. There's also in the political economy strand of literature, as we call it, some innovations. But there's also some blind spots. There's, for example, very little literature about the collective organization of teachers. There's very little about trade unions, teacher unions. The teachers are presented, the teacher figure is presented as a pretty lonely figure out there, without little, let's say, little opportunity for collective mobilization, which is sort of curious because the education sector remains one of the most unionized, and some would say the most unionized sector globally. There was a huge chunk of the literature, around 45%, I think it's around 126 titles out of the 279 that did not theorize globalization. So they spoke about teachers in an international context, on a global context, but they did not theorize it, which to us, of course, is a problem. If you want to develop the thinking about globalization and education and for teachers and teaching, it's a problem if you don't theorize it at all, even though you talk about them in international contexts. We also found there's a huge geographical bias, not so surprising, also because we have been focusing on the Anglophone literature. I did not mention that before, but that's a choice that we made to focus on the Anglophone literature, even though we would have competences also in French and in the Scandinavian languages, but we chose to have a rather tunnel vision, so to say, focusing on the Anglophone literature. That's something that we could also discuss. And just to give you a few indications, what can you use a scoping review for? I'll just talk about this in 2 minutes. So on the basis of our number-based coding system, we have been able to track over time how the different topics have been addressed in the body of literature that we have reviewed. And you can see that the yellow one is really the one is standing out with a huge increase, and that is the one that relates to teacher education, their professional development, their induction in workplaces, mentoring, and also the knowledge bases in terms of what they learn in initial teacher education and teacher training. There's a huge increase in that literature, it seems, on the basis of our review. Here is the geographical bias, very clearly represented. If you go across the different study types and you see what systems are being addressed, well, it's pretty clear that, there are some systems that are being very privileged in terms of being covered, and others not so much. I think Tanzania is one of the sub-Saharan countries that are being mostly addressed in the literature. There are huge white spots, so to say, on the map in the research literature, which of course makes you think, well, if you talk about globalization, what are you actually basing your thinking on? What kind of systems are you referring to? This is a very interesting figure. We cross-tabulated the use of theory and how the teacher key topics were being addressed in the literature. That means that, for example, for the around 160 titles in the reviewed body of literature that addressed what we here just call learning, that was the teacher key topic related to the education and learning and knowledge base of teachers. More than a half does not employ any globalization theory, even though they address to some extent teachers in international contexts. And what is remarkable is that the use of no theory is very dominant across the coverage of different topics. But still, the topic of labor market and the topic of learning stands out in particular, as more than 50% of the studies does not employ any sort of globalization theory. Yeah, I think that was more or less what I had to present, and I'm aware that it took a bit longer than I had actually hoped for, but we had some questions on the way as well, and I'm very ready to take many more questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Tore. That was really interesting and great presentation. Thank you. So while we're waiting for questions from participants, can I just ask very mundane questions? So basically, if you were to do something like that for your PhD, for example, I would imagine that what you've just described, this type of literature review, would form part of your results, and then you would build interpretation based on what you found here. Because, you know, most typically, I mean, obviously the PhD thesis can be structured in different ways, but let's say that the most typical model would be introduction, literature review of the phenomena, methodology, results, and then some sort of interpretation. So the literature review would be of the phenomena that you're interested in would be different to this sort of literature review that you're using as your research design, if I can say it like that. Would this be so, or how would you see that if someone, as I said, if someone were to do this for a PhD thesis project?
Yeah, I think I'm talking for many PhD students. I'm certainly talking for myself, when I'm thinking about the literature review I did during my PhD, it was not very informed by conscious decision making about which studies to include and not. I was working very much within the same paradigm and more or less implicitly following, well, a sort of snowballing method, I would say, where one piece of literature would take me to other pieces of literature that I found interesting and exciting. And then I would be discussing that in one of the first chapters of my PhD thesis. And I have seen other PhD theses where people have been more aware and been talking more about different, let's say, different research paradigms, but focusing on the same sort of knowledge interest, let's say online learning in higher education. I'm sure there are certainly different sort of literatures out there addressing that from very different perspectives, from very different theoretical angles. And I think you could do that as part of your PhD. I think that you could make it your whole PhD if you wanted to conduct a major literature review and, so to say, treat literature as your empirical data. But you could also do it at a much smaller scale, maybe with a much more narrow focus on something very specific, so that you make it manageable as part of your PhD, that you say, okay, you're looking at online learning, higher education, maybe in a very specific sort of settings, specific type of country settings, for example, specific types of higher education. What do I know in economics, for example, or education? So to be very narrow, to facilitate a very more narrow search strategy, so that you would not be overwhelmed by the sheer scope of your literature review. So it really depends on your choice. You could make it your whole PhD, I would say. I don't know what you would say, Janja, but you could also be very systematic still, if you're just conducting this literature as a foundation for your empirical inquiry of interviews and document analysis, for example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thanks. We have another question from Thomas saying, would you prioritize seeking literature on areas which you are not able to research yourself, or on similar areas as your own research, so you can triangulate your findings?
Oh. Yeah. I think that one of my main arguments in this presentation is that you have to make decisions when you are conducting a literature review, whatever sort of review you're undertaking. And I think the more informed decisions you can take, the better review you'll make, as a rule. That means that if you're more familiar with the literature, I think you'll produce, in principle, I really haven't thought about this before, but I think that the more you know about a field, the more familiar you are with it, I think you will be able to make more informed decisions. But it's probably worth a discussion, actually, if you're a stranger to a field, whether you can produce a good review. I think it would raise a lot of challenges. I hope I understood the question correctly. I don't know, Janja, what you think?
Yeah, I would only add that it really depends, again, on your research aims and questions and designs. And I think that you could actually do both, depending on your approach. So, if you incorporate literature as one of the data sources for triangulation, you may as well do that. But either way, whatever your approach is, when you are interested in a phenomena, you need to look at what we already know in the field, because otherwise, at a PhD level, you should make a contribution to the field and create new knowledge. So if you're not familiar with what we already know, how are you supposed to make a contribution? So that's why we always say, identify the gap in the literature that you're targeting. Now, what I found fascinating in your project, or was when I read previous papers, was that you had this whole kind of conceptualization, say, of your research problem. And then what you presented to us today was almost like a methodological design. And then you use your theories to interpret these findings. So for example, even in this slide that we are standing on now, where you find out that most of the studies in the themes don't use any globalization theories, and particularly so, for example, in, learning and labor market and so on, you can theorize that with your theories, of globalization or whatever your approach is, because it means, that is obviously evidence of something. It induces a particular kind of power relations, excludes particular actors and includes others, and so on. So it is, even if it seems apolitical, it's not, and that's the point. So you can, use these findings, and with your research design and theories you use, interpret it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think what I was thinking about our search strategy for this thing about what sort of role does your review serve in your research, and how is it going to inform what you are going to do in extension of that. I think for us it was important. Let's say that we would not be so familiar with a field, and maybe the supervisor that I had as a PhD student, for example, would not be so familiar with a field. Then it would have been very tempting just to rely on electronic databases, for example, and thereby we would have neglected some of the most interesting. Honestly, the most interesting part of the literature was not what was coming out of the electronic databases, in our review at least. Could very much differ from area to area, but certainly not in our review. The most interesting literature that has most to say about globalization and teachers was not from the electronic databases, but from the hand search and the purposive sampling. So yeah, Janja, it's very important for me to say that, well, I introduced these stages as part of as a sort of a structure to think about reviews. And I would also like to mention that, of course, there are other models out there. We have found this helpful, but I don't want to appear and to signal that you have to be very, very rigid and structured. There are other models. Most important is that you are being aware of the decisions that you take and what implications it has for the sort of findings or review that you're undertaking.
Yeah, we had a very good question actually connected to that from Joyce, saying that, would you say treating literature as empirical data necessarily involves doing a systematic review first? Or to ask this the other way around, if my literature review relies on a snowballing method, as you suggested, would it be okay to treat the literature I discover as empirical data, even though it's not intentionally exhaustive?
Yeah, I think that's it goes really to the point of some of the, here's that slide where I talk about, inspired by the title of the title of this webinar, treating literature as empirical data. When can you do that? And I would say then, well, depending on what is the purpose of the review that you're undertaking. I mean, often you are categorizing. That's what you would often be doing also when you're doing following a snowballing method. You end up categorizing different sorts of literature. You categorize according to a theme, according to the use of a theory, maybe according to a group of researchers who have developed something interesting. And already there, whether you are aware of it or not, you are treating it as a sort of data material that you can analyze and discuss. The question is, what kind of decisions are you making in that process, in that long series of processes, indeed? And can you explain what you did? And I think the question to ask back to the person who asked the question, because it's an excellent question, is then that if you're a PhD student, for example, okay, your supervisor will be asking you, well, how did you include these titles in your review? Why did you include those, not those? And then you can explain, well, you had a snowballing method and you can add more details. That will at least take you some of the way. But I think it's important to say that the more conscious you are about these decisions, the better your review will be. Even though I know it's demanding, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we've now reached the end, unfortunately, although I still have lots of questions and comments, but I have to refrain myself. Would you, do you have any last words, Tore, before I make a final announcement?
Yeah, I would actually just like to say, again, I would encourage you, if you're interested in this subject of reviews and review methodology, look into some of the references that I mentioned. And I would like to end with this nice quotation from Mary Kennedy, where she, again, stresses the importance of being aware of your decisions that you are making when you're trying as best as you can to define a literature, the literature that you want to review. And trying to be aware of the decisions that you take, because they are inevitable. Those decisions, you will always have to make some kind of decisions. And then if you have any questions, you're welcome to write me, and I'll try to answer you. And otherwise, you can also find me on Twitter. We have a project website as well. For those of you interested in teachers, you should definitely go there and check it out, I would say. And I have a personal website too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There was one more question from Eugenie, and I would suggest her to email you. Thanks for offering, Tore. So just to say that the recording of this video will be available for our students, and we'll post it on all the program sites. Tore also said you're happy to share the PowerPoint slides with the registered participants. So I will be sending an email to the list of registered participants, turning this PowerPoint into PDF. You've talked about publications that are either already published or are under review coming out of your project. So if anyone is interested in this particular project and the publications coming out, you can go to the web pages stated here. But Tore was talking about a working paper particularly prepared for this webinar. We've already shared this working paper with members of Lancaster University. If you are outside of Lancaster University and you would like to receive this, please email Tore directly,